Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome each and every one of you to our symposium on evangelicals and foreign policy. Many of you have just enjoyed session 1, Relief Development and Evangelical Engagement. This is our second and concluding panel, and it is entitled American Foreign Policy and the Evangelical Moment. This entire gathering, all the events that you see in front of you right now, this entire gathering is the brainchild of 3 kindred souls at Georgetown University. Professor Tom Bancroft, Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Professor Carol Lancaster, Director of the Mortara Center for International Studies. And me, Jacques Berlinerblau, Director of the Program for Jewish Civilization. It grew out of our mutual agreement that evangelicals were among some of the most dynamic political actors in contemporary America. The movement, undoubtedly, is important in electoral terms, but there was more. We also agreed that it was interesting. And in the realm of faith and election 2008, if it's important and interesting, then it is coming to Georgetown. My own interest in evangelicals is twofold. As a Bible scholar, I have become quite preoccupied, one might say obsessed, with what we might call evangelical hermeneutics. And by this I mean the way evangelicals read Scripture as a stimulus to the adaptation of very specific policy initiatives. Second, as a very unpopular voice within American secularism, I never tire of reminding my fellow freethinkers that they could learn a lot about politics from our conservative Christian friends. For truth be told, while secularism as a cultural and political movement is in a state of disrepair, evangelicals are flying high. I know of at least a dozen presidential contenders who are aggressively courting evangelical voters, but I can't think of one, not one, who really feels that he or she needs more non-believers or church-state lifers on board. What I see in modern evangelicalism is a movement that has come to political and organizational maturity. Today, our speakers will share with us their thoughts on how this very broad, and I warn you in advance, internally diverse movement thinks about foreign policy issues. Many of these foreign policy issues, I would add, were on no one's radar screens until conservative Christians, I use that kind of inaccurately, we should say evangelicals, I sometimes use conservative Christians to embody fundamentalists as well, brought them to the nation's attention. In this afternoon's session, we have assembled 3 extremely talented exponents and commentators on the evangelical moment, what we are calling the evangelical moment, and I'm sure they want it to last for more than a moment, and by all demographic data at our disposal, it is going to last for longer than a moment. They share some views in common and diverge radically on others. Each expresses his ideas with great clarity and wit. Perhaps they would attribute their abilities to a divine dispensation, something that we might call grace. But in secular parlance, we would prefer to speak of talent and discipline. But then again, how does one explain talent if not in divine paranormal terms? I want to thank each of our distinguished panelists for coming to Georgetown University today. And I'd like to pause for all of us to reflect the wonderful Americanness of this scene. We have on our panel 3 major voices in the diverse American evangelical movement. They have been invited to speak by a Jesuit university, and the session chair, that would be myself, is a secular Jew from Brooklyn, no less. So we have all the pieces together. This said, respectful disagreement is clearly a virtue at Georgetown, and I expect that we will have a very spirited, so to speak, Q&A. We will ask each of our guests to speak for about 15 minutes. I will be watching the clock fastidiously. And let me begin by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mr. Luis Lugo of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. Luis Lugo became the director of the Pew Forum in January 2004. Prior to joining the Pew Forum, he served as director of the religion program at the Pew Charitable Trusts in Philadelphia, a position he held for 7 years. Before joining the trusts, he was a professor of political science for more than 12 years, teaching courses in international relations, Latin American politics, and religion and public policy. After studying at the University of Memphis, where he received his BA, and Villanova, where he received his MA, he took his PhD in political science at the University of Chicago. Among his published works are several edited volumes, including Religion, Public Life, and the American Polity and Sovereignty at the Crossroads, Morality and International Politics in the Post-Cold War Era. A native of Cuba, he is listed in Who's Who among Hispanic Americans, He is married and has 3 children, and I hope you will all join me in welcoming him to Georgetown University today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that warm welcome. But do you have any tickets? Actually, you could have added to the diversity shtick that you mentioned there that you bring in a Cuban Catholic background to explain American evangelicals. It would have added to the irony. It does put one in mind of Yogi Berra, the great American philosopher, who upon hearing that a Jew had been elected mayor of Dublin, exclaimed, "Only in America." Well, my role here is very straightforward. We don't do advocacy work at the Pew Forum. We do research, we convene activities to bring, like this panel, thoughtful advocates to the table, but we ourselves do not take positions on any of these issues we'll be discussing today. My role is very simple, is to paint a brief portrait by drawing on our survey research of the attitudes of American evangelicals towards foreign policy issues. And I think when you see these numbers, they will underscore for you both the challenges and opportunities that thoughtful advocates like the 2 Richards up here have in front of them. I will be painting in broad strokes, but obviously in the Q&A we can burrow down deeper into these issues. I think you'll be surprised at some of these findings. Evangelicals throw you a curve from time to time, and on some of these foreign policy attitudes, they may not line up precisely as you would expect. Now, how elites and other leaders like the 2 Richards here handle this this information, I think, will be quite interesting. But I did find some surprises here as I looked at these figures. First of all, and this is the first slide, I think many people will be surprised, particularly those who still associate evangelicalism with William Jennings Bryan, I suppose, that evangelicals, in fact, are internationalist in orientation. More so, in fact, than other Americans. Again, I think this goes against the common perception that these folks are only internally oriented, focus exclusively on cultural war issues and don't look abroad very much. I find this, this 10-point gap quite revealing. So we can begin with that statement, that overall, evangelicals are more internationalist in orientation than other Americans. And of course, the reverse of that they're less isolationist. I have to go quickly. We only have 10 minutes here. So I have to be very un-Fidel Castro-like in my presentation. It's another way of saying that. Now, some of this, of course, is related to a sense among evangelicals that the United States has a special role to play in world affairs. And if you look at the findings of these 2 figures, the first chart and this one, they really track each other very, very closely. Those who believe that the U.S. has a special role to play tend to be, not surprisingly, much more internationalist in their orientation than those who do not take that view. Now, for evangelicals, I think, if you look at this third chart, this is not unconnected to their understanding of divine providence. Here's the theology again informing their approach to the world. Evangelicals believe that the United States, and I'm speaking here of 70% of evangelicals, believe that the United States has had special protection from God. Now, notice there are 2 subgroups there. That the really hard question, of course, was number 1, has had special protection which no other country has had. But if you look at the first 2 lines, the net, who answered yes, the U.S. has had special protection, it is a significant number. And varies quite dramatically from the rest of the population. Evangelicals are generally providentialists in their understanding of history, including their understanding of the United States' role in history. And we can get into some of the reasons why that's the case. In a sense, there's one answer that comes immediately to mind, and I'll show you some numbers on that. And the answer is Israel, which predisposes evangelicals towards both internationalism and a deep sense that God has a special role for the United States as a protector of Israel. Very deeply embedded in evangelical thinking, it shows up in all of our surveys. So part of this must be that evangelicals conclude if there is a special role for the United States and God has especially blessed the United States, then there is a corresponding responsibility for the United States to be active in world affairs. So that's the first large point, that evangelicals are more internationalists than you think. Point number two is that they are not as unilateralist as you might expect. I find some of these figures surprising, mostly because, as you'll see soon, I tended to read a lot of this multilateral versus unilateral through the prism of how people feel about the United Nations. But that's a mistake if you look at these numbers. Evangelicals are no less multilateralists in terms of how the United States ought to engage in world affairs than the American population as a whole. In fact, they track the U.S. public precisely on this. Now, to move to my caveat here, they are less favorable towards the UN. I'm sorry, this is good. We'll hit this one first. This is another way of getting at that question, which is the question of how do we balance the national interest with the interest of allies. And as you'll see, there is no difference between evangelicals and non-evangelicals on this. By the way, when you see 2 or 3 points up there, that's within the margin of error. It means nothing statistically. Right? They're identical. That's what you can say from this. Right? So both on the general predisposition and on this question of shared leadership and the question of national interest versus the interest of allies, very much tracking with the rest of the population. Here's where you begin to see some differences on the United Nations. Evangelicals are generally less favorable towards the United Nations as a vehicle for international engagement and multilateralism than other Americans. The net favorables are considerably lower than for non-evangelicals. Deep-seated suspicion, going way back, about the United Nations, which I'm sure the two Richard could speak at length, some of the theological concerns that lurk behind responses to this kind of question. So yes, take the interest of allies into account, but when it comes to the UN, evangelicals are much more cautious, and especially so when it comes to the use of military force, which is the next slide. Here, they are really skeptical of binding the use of American military force too closely to the wishes of the United Nations and its deliberations. And this is, you can see, one of the big rubs between the United States and its European allies, who tend to be very internationalist and consensus-oriented in terms of large international bodies. The United States as a whole, but evangelicals in particular, are much more skeptical of multilateralism that's channeled primarily through the United Nations. So here, national sovereignty tends to emerge. So that's the second point. Really no different, except for the UN, than most Americans when it comes to how that international involvement should take place, multilateralism versus unilateralism. Now, just a few comments here on foreign policy values and priorities. That's the next chart. I think this is quite interesting. On some of these values, there is no difference between evangelicals and non-evangelical. And by the way, I broke it out this way because evangelicals are such a large percentage of the American public that when you simply compare evangelicals to the whole population, you don't get the true picture. That's why I've broken it down, evangelicals, non-evangelicals, and then you see how the population as a whole, including both of those categories, come out. Very high emphasis on moral principles. Now that's true of most Americans, but especially true of evangelicals. Cautious, pretty much a wash. I thought this was interesting, being decisive. That may be connected to the freedom of movement when it comes to the use of military force, for instance, and not being too beholden to the United Nations on those kinds of decisions. Being practical, all Americans are pragmatic here. It doesn't matter what the theological coloration. Being compassionate, I thought, was interesting, and I'll have maybe somebody on the panel or somebody out there explain to me why this does not manifest itself on certain policy priorities that we'll look at soon. Question of world hunger, for instance, some of the issues that we're concerned here. Why there is not the similar gap between evangelicals and non-evangelicals on those policy questions that touch upon this issue of compassion. Being flexible, again, is a wash. Following religious principles, and you can see a big difference in that one as well. And the last two are pretty much the same. So again, on many of these basic core values, very similar, and they tend to track, with one exception, the views of the majority of Americans on either side of the 50% mark, with that one exception of following religious principles, where they really do deviate significant. Only a minority of non-evangelicals, but a solid majority of evangelicals take that point of view. Now let's talk just briefly about specific issue areas and see how these values get filtered down to specific policy orientation. Basically broken down as a slew of these things, maybe 15 or 20. And what I've done is just take the top 5, the bottom 5, and the middle 5 here for us to comment. So you get some sense of how evangelicals are lining up. On the top 5 foreign policy priorities, I think one can safely say, looking at these numbers, that evangelicals track very closely with the rest of the population. Whether it's terrorism or protecting American jobs, etc., not much difference between evangelicals and non-evangelicals on these large, top 5 foreign policy priorities. On the next 5, you begin to see some differences. Evangelicals much more concerned with drug trafficking than other Americans. Slightly more concerned, interestingly, on reducing illegal immigration. This was a very interesting discussion that took place between Latino evangelicals and non-Latino evangelicals on this question of immigration reform, which I think is really quite interesting. By the way, this is not here, but other surveys that we've done, Latino evangelicals, like white evangelicals, trending fairly heavily Republican on this. So this was a particularly interesting debate within the Republican Party between Latino and non-Latino evangelicals on the question of immigration. But again, that's still, it's less than 10 points, but it is statistically significant. Dealing with global climate change. Sorry, Richard, I didn't put this in here just to make your life miserable. This Richard, to make your life miserable, but it is true that we find a significant difference in the priority that the evangelical public places upon climate change compared to non-evangelicals. That's before you got really practical. So, I was going to point that out, Richard, that this is, this data are about a year old or so, a year and a couple of months, and a lot has happened in between. No question about it. It would be interesting to see how these numbers move. I did compare these with the previous set of numbers we had, and there had been, I think it was a 5 or 6% jump among evangelicals in terms of having this as a priority. The gap, however, between evangelicals and non-evangelicals has remained the same. Okay, so it's still fairly significant. And finally, this is the bottom 5 issues. Again, a lot of Americans will say these issues are important, but we force them and say, what ought to be the top priority here? And not surprisingly, given their view of the UN, evangelicals don't think that should be a very high priority. But I thought it was interesting on defending human rights, helping to improve living standards. They track pretty closely with other Americans. The difference here is on religious persecution, where evangelicals seem to be place a much higher priority upon that foreign policy issue than other Americans. They've also cooled down, I'm just comparing the numbers on promoting democracy significantly in the last couple of years, and a lot of this has tended to track the fall-off in support for the Iraq War, where evangelicals, by the way, still give solid majority support to the proposition that it was the right decision But they too have been dropping. As I recall, in May of '03, it was like 84% approval among evangelicals that it was the right decision. I think the survey we did that just released last week, that figure was down to around 59%. I'd have to check. So it has fallen, but there's still a huge gap between evangelicals and others on the Iraq War. I was going to show you just a couple of charts on Israel, but if you want me to stop, Mr. Chairman, I will at this point, and we can get back to the Israel question.
Sure. No, okay. Take 2 more minutes.
All right, look, there's one issue that I would put apart from every other issue here. Evangelicals, like most Americans, are going to mix their values and practical judgments on this, that, and the other. There's one issue in which, and all the polling that we've done, evangelicals is just unmovable. It is the lodestar by which they tend to look at the world. I think it was involved in their strong anti-communism, although there were other reasons too. I think it has something to do with the deep skepticism of Muslims that you see in the evangelical community, much more so than in the public at large. And the issue is Israel. Can I come back to that slide for just 1 minute? And so, Israel gets significant support from American evangelicals. Now, Israel gets significant support from the U.S. population as a whole by a factor of 4. They favor, Israel over the Palestinians in terms of their sympathies. For evangelicals, I think that's almost, 8 or 9%, factor of 8 or 9, that they favor. I mean, a huge, huge discrepancy here. What's going on behind that? I'll just give you 2 other questions that I think may shed some light on this. One is the question of the land. So here's where biblical interpretation, and since the chairman is an expert in hermeneutics, I thought I'd mention this. It has to do very much with how evangelicals interpret the Bible on this. By a whopping percentage, evangelicals believe that God gave the land of Israel to the Jews. It's a deep-seated theological conviction, which sets them very much apart from other Americans. Although you can still see that among non-evangelicals, about 1/3 take that view. Among evangelicals, it's more than 2/3. I think it also has to do with the question of prophecy. Many evangelicals are convinced that the end-time scenarios pivot around the whole question of Israel and God's design for Israel. So here again, you see huge gaps in evangelical thinking and non-evangelical thinking on this question of how Israel fits into biblical prophecy. Now, let me conclude then just very briefly, if you can go back 4, the priorities, because I think we've got to introduce this level of reality here. My PhD was in international relations, so I'm normally inclined that way. And we've been talking here about issue priorities within the broad area of foreign policy. But make no mistake about it, most Americans are primarily oriented towards domestic policy. And I think that this last chart, not to depress any internationalists here, has to be kept in mind. Now, it is the case that evangelicals are less inclined to say that domestic issues are to trump, but still is basically a 2-to-1 margin among evangelicals. That the United States, that the government ought to put its effort into solving problems at home rather than setting the world aright. Among non-evangelicals, that percentage is even higher. So please keep in mind as we discuss all these issues, where development fits within the foreign policy hierarchy in the views of most Americans, including evangelicals, but also where foreign policy issues as a whole fit within the broad spectrum of policy priorities. And I think we're safe to say from these numbers that domestic policy still trumps, even with this high interest on the question of terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lugo. Now we will move from what I labeled a commentator on evangelicalism to what we might call exponents. Richard Land is our next speaker, president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Dr. Land has served as the president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission since 1988. During his tenure as spokesman on Capitol Hill for the largest non-Catholic denomination in the country, Dr. Land has represented Southern Baptists' interests in the halls of Congress, before U.S. presidents, and in the major media. A prolific writer, his latest book is entitled Imagine, A God-Blessed America, being published by Broadman and Holman, 2005. He also hosts 2 nationally syndicated radio programs that reach more than 1.5 million listeners each week. In July 2005, Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist appointed Dr. Land to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent and bipartisan federal agency. That same year, Mr. Land was featured in Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals in America. He received his BA from Princeton and his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford. Mr. Richard Land, thank you very much.
Thank you. My most recent book comes out next Tuesday. It's called The Divided States of America, ? What liberals and conservatives are missing in the God and Country shouting match. And it's an equal opportunity offender. It's going to make conservatives and liberals unhappy in different chapters. But I do talk a good bit about the subject of evangelicals and foreign policy because I must say, Louise, thank you for that very helpful survey. And there wasn't one single thing in the entire survey that surprised me. It actually confirmed most of what I thought. I've been asked to talk about evangelicals and foreign policy. As Walter Russell Mead, in a wonderful article, which all of you need to read if you haven't read, in Foreign Affairs in the September-October issue of last year, points out, when you talk about evangelicals and foreign policy, we've seen at least parts of this film before, because evangelicals were the dominant force in U.S. culture during much of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson perhaps being the supreme fruit of that, and Wilsonian democracy. And at least in the evangelical and the Anglo-American world, evangelicals have long supported humanitarian and human rights issues and policies on a global basis. I think of William Wilberforce and as an evangelical in the movement to abolish the slave trade in the British Empire. I think of the fact that both British and American evangelicals were very much involved in seeking to support national liberation movements in the 19th century, particularly those that were seeking to break away from Ottoman rule. A number of reform campaigns against sati, the immolation of widows in India, against foot binding in China, the support of female education throughout the developing world, and against human trafficking in its 19th century expression known as the white slave trade. And I might also add, when you talk about national liberation movements, that evangelicals were the strongest supporters of the revolution in the United States, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. It was the nonconformist evangelicals that most strongly supported the American colonists' cause when it came in their war of liberation against Great Britain. And also, when it comes to Israel, as Walter Russell Mead points out in his article, U.S. policy toward Israel is another area where increased influence of evangelicals is evident, but the relationship has a long history. In the 19th century, there were elements of American Protestant evangelicalism which were Zionist before there was a Jewish Zionist movement. In the 19th century, there were evangelicals that repeatedly petitioned U.S. officials to help establish a refuge in the Holy Land for persecuted Jews from Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Even the reason we're here talking about evangelicals and foreign policy is because evangelicals have become a much larger part of the American landscape over the last 40 years. As Mead points out in his article, what we've seen in the last 40 years is a truly revolutionary shift as the mainline denominations have virtually imploded and the evangelical denominations have virtually exploded. Just to give you an example, between 1960 and 2003, Southern Baptists alone gained more members than Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and the United Church of Christ together lost. In 1960, there were almost 2 million more Methodists than there were Southern Baptists in the United States. By 2003, there were more Southern Baptists than there were Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and the UCC combined. By some estimates, anywhere between 34 and 40% of the population claims to be evangelical. And one point that I think needs to be made, and it's an important one, and Walter Russell Mead goes into some detail, and I'll leave you to look for him for the details, but there's a huge distinction that needs to be made that is often not made in the media and by those who comment on such between fundamentalists and evangelicals. And most American evangelicals are not fundamentalists. Billy Graham is a good example of the distinction. People who are fundamentalists in the United States look upon Billy Graham as a figure of great compromise. They don't have much admiration for him. In fact, they criticize him for having compromised with the culture, whereas he is perceived as a person of huge stature among evangelicals. As Mark Knoll pointed out in Christianity Today's October 2006 issue, their 50th anniversary issue, he says there's a clear distinction between separatistic and intentionally narrow fundamentalism and more open, intentionally outgoing evangelicalism. While outsiders have not always recognized this distinction, Knoll says, it has been critical. Fundamentalists would seek to protect the gospel by separating from the world. Evangelicals, by contrast, would promote it by engaging the world. This critical distinction, engagement versus separation, is the defining difference between evangelicalism and fundamentalism in the United States. And I think it's important to point out that evangelical engagement leads them to be involved in foreign policy. And as Nancy Ammerman pointed out in an article in the American Interest entitled Deep and Wide, The Real American Evangelicals, she says that for most evangelicals, even those who do not believe that there is a continuing covenant between God and the Jews, there is still a belief or a conviction that America can and should do some good in the world, especially in protecting Israel, end quote. Now, the data that Louise shared with us about evangelicals believing that America has a special role to play in the world doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, the only thing that surprises me is the numbers weren't even higher. For significant segments of American evangelicalism, American exceptionalism, and this is very important, does not mean that America has a special claim on God, but that God has a special claim on America. In other words, American exceptionalism is a doctrine of obligation, responsibility, and sacrifice, and service in the cause of freedom, not a doctrine of pride, privilege, and prejudice. They believe that we have an obligation and a responsibility not to try to impose freedom, but to share it. Now, the three questions that I was asked to briefly comment on, I'll try to do quickly. When did evangelicals begin to make foreign affairs a priority? In their modern 1940s onward expression, as opposed to their 19th century abolitionist and social reformer incarnation, evangelical involvement with foreign affairs really took off with the post-World War II anti-communism movement. Some of you older folks will remember the Christian anti-communist crusade. Communism and the Christian obligation to oppose communism was a big theme in the Southern Baptist churches that I grew up in the 1950s. This strong anti-communism, coupled with the birth of the Jewish state of Israel in 1948, propelled evangelicals into the world of foreign policy in new and unprecedented ways. Evangelicals, this was especially true for the large and growing segments of American evangelical Christianity, which believed the Jews to continue to be God's chosen people and that God had a continuing covenant with them. I might also point out that there are some regional differences here for reasons having to do with a long military tradition and some other reasons. The South was the one part of the country that actually supported Franklin Roosevelt's internationalist policies, and isolationist support was lowest in the South, internationalist support was strongest in the South in getting the United States into World War II. One reason is a long military tradition, and a second reason is it's the one part of the country that's been invaded by a foreign power and occupied, otherwise known as the Federal Army. What specific issues have most galvanized the evangelical community? Other than anti-communism and other than believing that we have a special role to play in protecting and expanding freedom, human rights issues, religious freedom, political freedom, sex and human trafficking issues, genocide issues, etc. How have evangelical leaders mobilized public support for their positions in collaboration with other religious and secular advocacy organizations? Evangelicals, remember engagement. Evangelicals believe in engagement with those that they can make common cause with, including Roman Catholics and Mormons and others. Fundamentalists look upon that kind of association as anathema. Evangelicals use the communication means at their disposal, the pulpit, the church and denominational newsletters and periodicals, radio and television media, and the internet to make rank and file evangelicals aware of abuses or crises or to motivate them to involvement. Evangelical leaders have grown accustomed in the last 25 years or so at least to working in collaboration with other faiths and secular advocacy organizations on issues of common cause. And I would say that the most powerful weapon for impacting public policy in the evangelicals' arsenal is their ability to appeal to a highly motivated grassroots membership that has shown an increasing willingness to get involved and to make their voices heard, both with their elected representatives and with the media.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Our third and final speaker, before we start opening up to questions and discussion, is Richard Cizik of the National Association of Evangelicals, the Vice President for Governmental Affairs. Richard Cizik is the Vice President for Governmental Affairs with the National Association of Evangelicals. His primary responsibilities include editing publications such as NAE Washington Insight, directing the association's Washington Insight Briefing and Christian Student Leadership Conferences, setting its policy direction on issues before Congress, the White House, and the Supreme Court, as well as serving as a national spokesman on issues of concern to evangelicals. He's probably the most quotable evangelical, if not American, on the face of the earth. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Cizik.
Quotable. I'll try and be at least somewhat quotable today, in the sense that I think I would like to sketch a little bit of the big picture. Tell a story first. That's always good. That's what preachers do. We believe in narrative, we evangelicals. We go to the seminary and they tell us it's really quite simple. For those of you who are Catholics or outside the evangelical world, it's really reducible to the following. And I would challenge you to go to any evangelical church, find a preacher in the pulpit today who doesn't do this. This is your clue. It's your inside tip from your evangelical broker. It's called hook, book, look, and took. It's really that simple, my friends. The hook is what you do to get that member of the congregation to listen to what you're having to say. That's the hook. You can use all means. For the American male in particular, it's the storyline. Tell the story. That's the hook. It's got to be good. Secondly, book. For us as evangelicals, there is no other book. There is one book. And we as evangelicals are distinguished from mainline Protestants and others who tend to be neo-orthodox in their theology. The word becomes real to the mainliners and to others when you have an existential experience with it. No, for the evangelical, it is objectively the Word of God. That's infallible and inerrant in the original autographs, mind you. Not in the King James Version, in the original autographs, but that's the book, the Word of God. And you've got to take that book and you analyze it and you explain it. That's the look. You look at it and you apply it. All this I will attempt to do in the space of 10 minutes. But the look is that analysis and the took is the takeaway. What is the takeaway that you're expecting the member of that congregation to leave that day with a change in behavior? And that's very important because there's one distinction, according to Alan Gelso, that separates evangelicals. I like Richard's positive, negative, and I'll explain a little bit about that more. But Alan Gelso says it's American pietism. You want one paradigm. There are all kinds of differentiations in the American food group, American religious food group, that is Anglican, Reformed, Pentecostal, and otherwise. You can look at all those, try and assess them. You'll find the differences in the large mainline Protestant movement. Of course, the Lutherans have their two-state traditions, but in the evangelical world, something brings us all together, and he says it's pietism. That you see uniquely American sense from our pietist brethren, of course, in which the belief and the action are two sides of the same spiritual coin. We are not going to believe something if we are not going to act on it. You can't do the one without the other, and according to the writers of the American Historical Review, it is that idea which has so challenged American politics and has made to many Americans, evangelicals, objectionable. It's that pietism that says we're going to translate it. We're going to do it not only in our personal lives as best we know how to do, but we're going to even do it politically. Now, what are the origins of this movement? Let me tell you a little story. It goes back, I'll bring it to the current present predicament that faces NAE. In 1942, two men were very close friends. They were in fact in each other's weddings as best man to one another, and one was named Carl McIntyre, and the other was Harold John Ocken. He was the pastor of Park Street Church on Boston Common. If you've never been there, go in. You'll see he presided at that historic church for over 30 years. He was not just the president of NAE, its first president. He brought this movement together for the purpose of having a voice on these issues that in the 40s the movement didn't have. Ockengay was pastor at Park Street Church, Harold John Ockengay. His friend was Carl McIntyre. McIntyre came out of the fundamentalist movement. They were friends, but they both went to the Spirit of St. Louis meeting of which NAE was formed in 42. McIntyre left, Ockengay stayed. The original denominations were less than 24 have now become over 65. And the movement that didn't warrant a mention in the 1945 annual yearbook of American faith put out by the then Federal Council of Churches, the only denomination of the NAE in that year that ever warranted even a mention. Guess? Any guesses? Take your guess. It was the Assemblies of God, one of our larger denominations. It was in the book. Nothing else warranted a mention. NAE didn't warrant a mention in around 1945. But NAE was formed, you see, to be that voice on these issues. And McIntyre left. Why? For the reason that separates the movement today from the fundamentalists and the evangelicals. And I happen to think, and I've run this by the American evangelicals, best historians, in fact, and they're all flocking out there to Notre Dame. What's going on here? The evangelicals, but Mark Knoll and George Marsden, both great historians. I've asked this question about the debate going on in evangelicalism today over some of the broadening of the agenda. And he said it's because this is Marsden, mind you, this is just 3 weeks ago. He said it's because some of them really are modern day fundamentalists. Well, what was the distinction? He said, well, just look at the two men. What were they? McIntyre said, we will, as Richard Land has said, we will separate. Ockengay said, we will engage. McIntyre said, we will retreat. Ockengay said, we will advance. McIntyre said, we will judge. Ockengay said, we will love. McIntyre said, well, we're going to shape the world. And today, you never have heard of the organization he created called the American Council of Christian Churches. And the day after NAE released its statement on torture in a world of terror at our most recent convention on March 9th, out in the Midwest in Minnesota, yes, I admit it, I tuned into IMUS. Across the scroll line of IMUS came the word, the National Association of Evangelicals condemns torture in its war against terror. What has transpired in the 50, well, it's now 64 years, you see, since that split occurred, you literally do have Walter Russell Mead saying, I met his father the other day, an amazing guy, Mead saying the evangelicals are the way. They are shaping international affairs. Why? Because they have the positive, soft Calvinism that enables them to approach the world in a way that is positive and aggressive. All the way back to Ockengay, Carl F.H. Henry, Billy Graham, all of them. They were the founders of the movement, you see, that has today made them, according to the most recent Baylor survey, 100 million strong. 1 out of 3 Americans actually go, according to the Baylor survey, I don't know if you disagree with Luis, you can say so, go to an evangelical church on a Sunday each week. Amazing. And these people are shaping international affairs. It began, yes, in the 40s onward. You're absolutely right, Richard. There were those. Donald Gray Barnhouse, a 10th Presbyterian, before the war broke out, he was raising money to get Jews out of Germany. sensing the Nazi peril. Here was Barnhouse and others secretly funneling money to get Jews out. This is, you see, part of, yes, a heritage that goes back into Wilsonian democracy, yes, but even back further. I'm a Presbyterian. We were the black robes of the American Revolution. And today, you see, we are the activists on this broad agenda. Come to the present, since I'm running out of time. The board meets in Minnesota. The new president, Leif Anderson, pastor of a megachurch, 5,000 plus, happens to have in his congregation, by the way, I think the politician of the future, a Republican who can win in a Democratic state, the governor of Minnesota. Well, here you have the evangelical leaders meeting, and of course the critics are out for the neck of, for the head on the platter, John the Baptist, if you will, of the Washington office director, because he's saying we want to address all the issues. I'm not making a case for any particular public policy solution on climate change. I am saying we will broaden the agenda, and that's what's been happening since the mid-90s and even earlier. Most don't know it, but far before the release of this document in '94 called For the Health of the Nation, an Evangelical Public Civic Engagement, back in the mid-1980s, NAE had begun and carried on for 8 years after the Evil Empire speech to the NAE in 1983 in Orlando, Florida. A speech which I had requested from the White House, met with the speechwriters, a congressman by the name of Dana Rohrabacher. And the other, he's from California, the other being Terry Dolan, met with them. The speech was given. It commenced an 8-year program until the fall of the Berlin called the Peace, Freedom, and Security Studies Project. That was the guideline you see for waging peace from our historical biblical viewpoints in an age of communism. Well, the communists fell due in significant measure, you see, to the activism of these evangelicals. And today we have this bigger agenda. And the question for us and the question for the leaders of the evangelical movement today is, will we be divided by a broader agenda? In my mind, no, we will not be divided by a broader agenda. We agree. We are significantly unified, far more than others outside. They look to find minor glitches, perils to this monolithic movement that actually isn't so monolithic anyway. But we are engaging on all of the issues. That was the second question. And how have we done it? By all the means you well know. It is the most grassroots movement that exists in America, that evangelical movement. And you cannot begin to talk about the future politically unless you understand where this movement is going. I happen to think the data reveal not only increased support, 70% of the evangelicals plus support addressing climate change, global warming, but they are taking a very serious look at this war in Iraq. 60% have historically supported the war against terror, 60% even higher, if you couch it that way. But when asked recently about the surge, 60% said, no, I don't agree with that. They're having real trepidations about that. So will the movement remain as effective? You can bet your booty. Why has it been so effective? Because we've passed legislation, and we don't need to enumerate them. You can check it out, read all the articles. We've done 8, 9 major landmark bills, from the IRFA bill, which these two organizations, the Southern Baptist Convention and NAE, largely by their joint efforts created, which addresses religious persecution, and into the future.
Sex Trafficking Act. And
Sex Trafficking Act, the International Religious Freedom Act, the Sex Trafficking Act, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the End Demand Act, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the North Korea Human Rights Act, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we have an agenda into the future. Lastly, read this article, The Atlantic, Hot Prospects, by a guy who did a conversion himself, as I did on climate change, Greg Easterbrook, Who Wins, Who Loses. Most recent issue of Atlantic. More importantly in the article is the next iteration, The Real Roots of Darfur, which the writer says, this is a Stephen Ferris, that the roots of this conflict are really in the land. It's not in the conflict of race as much as it is in the land itself, caused in part by desertification. As someone who's flown into the desert, the King of Morocco gave me his plane, and my wife and I flew with some staff way out into the deserts of the Sahara. And you see the expansion of the desert, which is occurring throughout that part of the world. You see it happening right now in places like Niger And if we want to look at the threats internationally, the conflict threats that we will face, they are rooted in environmental causes at times. And we need to understand that. We need to be active. We will do this on a broader agenda, and we will remain unified. Absolutely. Even Richard and I will be. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We do have a rather long period for some discussion. My job now is to kind of bring the issues together in about 5 or 7 minutes. I do not like lecturing after folks that have a pulpit. I once taught at an unnamed theological seminary, and they used to have something called Sunday sermon practice, where they practiced their sermons in front of an empty church, and it was like watching jumbo jets take off. The sheer power, right, the rhetorical power of these speakers. This is what I feel like coming after Mr. Cizik. Nevertheless, I must go forward. All right, a few issues that we wanted to address, which maybe a little bit more could be said about, and will be said about in the responses and in the Q&A with the audience. Maybe we should look at the state of Israel. One word which did not come up, which I'd love to hear more about from our panelists, one term, was premillennial dispensationalism. There's also postmillennial dispensationalism. There are many varieties. What Mr. Lugo referred to as the internal diversity shtick, I think is a little more than a shtick. There are actual differences amongst evangelicals, which brings me to point 2 on the heels of Mr. Cizik's remarks. We will not be divided, we will be unified. That's all well and good, but the fascinating development over the last 2 or 3 years, and I think Mr. Cizik is an example of this with his intervention on the environment, has been the increasing, shall we say, appearance of divergence within the evangelical movement on questions such as the environment, on questions such as foreign policy in Iraq, so on and so forth. To me, it's a sign of success, and it's only natural. How can 50, 60, 70 million Americans be completely unified on one issue? 100. Okay, we'll do that. How about a quarter of the electorate? Let's go for that. How can a quarter
of the voting population, absolutely, according to Gallup. 25% of the voting population.
Right. With that said, one wonders if the Republican Party, which right now seems to be aligned in certain ways with American evangelicals, is simply not going to be big enough. I listened very carefully to the title of Mr. Land's forthcoming book, and I've noticed this in a lot of evangelical commentary. We're not Democratic, we're not Republican, we're evangelicals first and foremost. I wonder if this portends or points to something coming very soon, which might be extremely interesting in terms of American electoral politics. All right, so the second remark is big evangelicalism, a movement that is getting so large that just the laws of electoral physics are demanding that it split up. We are seeing signs of certain fissures, and again, Mr. Cizik's intervention on the environment is an example of that, and I would ask our panelists maybe to address that. With the United Nations, the question was raised as to a lack of enthusiasm on the part of American evangelicals vis-a-vis the UN. I'll offer my theory as to why I think it is very difficult for American evangelicals to work on an equal footing with a host of governments who are, to put it mildly, non-Christian, be they Islamic or heathen. I do feel there is a deep doctrinal difficulty in joining in common cause on a whole range of issues in the United Nations. As for Israel, we discussed the question of premillennial and postmillennial dispensationalism. I really would like to hear a little bit more about that. The evangelical fundamentalist split is something which I find fascinating. As we know, they are clearly not the same thing. What is occurring today in American secularism strikes me as very, very similar, where we have secular fundamentalists in Jim Wallace's terms, and we have some secularists that are saying there must be some form of engagement with religious thinkers. So we're about a good 50 years behind in secular politics, where we ourselves are trying to confront the same issue that was confronted 50 years ago. Do we engage or do we retreat? With that said, the question was also asked of our panelists, when did evangelicals re-enter the arena in terms of foreign policy thinking? Mr. Land mentioned the battle against communism, which I think is extremely interesting. I think it gives lie to the notion that evangelicals just reappeared in 1973 after Roe v. Wade, out of the blue. My model, and we will ask the commentators to share their opinions on this, is from 1925 Scopes to 1973, a perhaps on the surface silent evangelicalism was getting its act together internally in its own communities. It was doctrinally streaming itself out. It was having very necessary debates about dogma, about political action, about questions pertaining to the movement itself, and it emerged, at least on the surface, in 1973, and with the advent of the moral majority in the late 70s and early 80s. However, and I don't know if the panelists would agree with me, I don't think it just popped up in 1973. There was a lot of groundwork, especially on the grassroots level, that was being performed prior to that. The question of will we be unified or divided, I keep coming back to this. I would like to raise another topic that wasn't raised at all today. Black evangelicals, who don't always vote the same way as white evangelicals do. And we all have those images of John Kerry feeling comfortable for once in a black evangelical church or a Latino evangelical church. He's clapping, he's happy, he doesn't feel forced, and when he's speaking in front of white evangelicals, he seems to be having a rather hard time of it, as the National Press Corps is following him around and pointing out that he's having kind of a hard time of it. So perhaps we might want to see if there are differences in terms of foreign policy between white evangelicals and African American evangelicals. The last remark, why is it working? And it's clearly working, at least electorally it's working. We heard Mr. Cizik speaking about soft Calvinism. The term I'd like to bring up is institutional genius. To me, it's much more secular and it's much more explicable in terms of human motivations. It strikes me that American evangelicals are to structural organization what Jews have been to perhaps a literature, a midrash. It's just something they do very, very well. The genius of the evangelical movement, one of the geniuses, there are many, is an organizational genius that manages to get people excited into churches, into polling booths, listening to radio stations, and I think politically this is all fair game. There's no dirty pool involved in that, and it's something that other American political movements should seek to emulate. With that said, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to respond in maybe a minute or two to anything they might have found interesting or objectionable in what I said, and then if you want to start queuing up for the microphone, we can begin with that. So I'll start with
dictatorial regimes that routinely violate the human rights of their own people, that Russia and China have veto power on the Security Council, and that the UN actually hasn't done near as good a job as some other multilateral organizations like NATO in actually doing what they set out to do. And so I think that long pragmatic streak in America, evangelicals are pragmatic, and they just don't think the UN works very well. The only reason we were able to intervene in Korea with a UN intervention was that Russia, the Soviet Union, was boycotting the Security Council at the time, and we got to vote before they could get back and veto it. Otherwise, we would have had a multilateral force in Korea, not a UN force. When it comes to the premillennial, of course, the premillennial issue is the reason why evangelicals, the vast majority of evangelicals, are so rock solid on Israel. There is a division within evangelicalism. D. James Kennedy would be an example of the replacement theology. Within evangelicals, there's a large segment that believe in what's called replacement theology, that the church has replaced Israel, and that the church is now heir to any promises that God gave to Israel, and so that there's not a continuing covenant between the Jews and God. The other element of evangelicalism, which is a majority, and that's a big change. This would not have been true 30 or 40 years ago. It now is true that a majority of people who would identify themselves as evangelicals, not a big majority, but a majority, would argue that God had made a special covenant with the Jews, that the Jews are God's chosen people, and that God blesses those who bless the Jews, God curses those who curse the Jews, and that God gave the land of Israel to the Jews forever. There is an element of self-interest in evangelicals' staunch support for Israel. Millions and millions and millions of them do believe, as a matter of faith, that God blesses those who bless the Jews, and God curses those who curse the Jews. As my mother explained to me as I was watching a documentary in 1956 as a 10-year-old boy, Richard, you see all of the bombed out buildings in Germany. They had a plane flying over Germany in 1945. She said, that's what happens when you curse the Jews. If we want God to bless America, America has to bless the Jews. Don't underestimate that as part of that rock solid support for Israel.
Mr. Cizik?
I don't underestimate that at all, Richard. I agree with what you're saying, but I would say, and I have a unique heritage in the sense that my grandmother on my father's side was a Jewish refugee from Poland who came to the United States, married an elevator operator in Chicago, and moved to Wisconsin. But anyway, that was Jewish on my grandfather's side, but also on my mother's side, a Presbyterian, Scottish Presbyterian, in fact, heritage, emigrated to the West Coast where I was raised. And so I'm this interesting hybrid. I went to seminary, Denver Seminary, precisely because I objected to the premillennial pessimism that I'd seen in the evangelical church. Went to Denver Seminary because its president, now emeritus, Vernon Brownswood, was writing expressly in those years at a seminary, then called the Conservative Baptist Theological Seminary in Denver, against, you see, the pessimism that led people to depart from engaging with society. And so here was a young kid who came to faith Christ in college, went to an evangelical seminary, and was confronting here both sort of traditions. Technically, Presbyterians are adherents of replacement theology. So on the one hand, I feel a lot like those within the Reformed community of NAE. We have, you see, and interestingly enough in NAE, the Pentecostals, the International Pentecostal Holiness Assembly of God, and all those, as well as the Reformed tradition, the Christian Reformed Church, the Presbyterian Church in America, the Evangelical Presbyterian, and others. And so you have within NAE this interesting hybrid of denominations that are, in some cases, strong like the Assemblies of God, premillennialists, pre-tribulationists, rapturists, who buy left behind books. And on the other hand, you see these Presbyterian ministers who think this is theological heresy, and counsel their members not to read the books and not to take them seriously any more so than a John Grisham novel. And you see, say there is no way in the world, a promise made to Abraham in Genesis for land from the Great Sea to the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is modern-day Baghdad, belongs to the secular state of Israel. And so you have, yes, a deep-seated concern for the survival of Israel and the Jewish state, but not so easy a contentment with this promise that, well, you bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. I believe personally that that is a promise inherited by the church. The church is the new Israel. And that isn't applicable to the secular state of Israel. Now, am I willing to afford the possibility, Richard, that yes, there is something else that is going on?
Well, I don't think it's the secular. I don't think it's just the secular state of Israel. I think it is the Jewish people.
Fair enough. That would be
the
more.
Jewish people.
Okay, but what,
worldwide.
Okay, fair enough. That would help me indeed mesh these two traditions: the the replacement theology and the premillennialism that comes from my Jewish heritage. But see, evangelicals, in a lot of ways, I think to understand them today, are in two worlds. That's how you can have Jerry Falwell rail, you see, against Sodom and Gomorrah, America, the Sodom and Gomorrah, blame 9/11 on us, and our wickedness. At the same time, call us to the highest and best heritages associated with Winthrop. We are a city on a hill. How can you have both? A city on a hill and Sodom and Gomorrah all in the same place? Well, it's pretty hard, but we sort of live with some of these dichotomies, these two worlds, just like we do with religion and science. But see, what is changing is the evangelical mind, especially on the bigger picture issues, which is what we're here about today. Why are we being successful? Well, it's not simply because the domestic issues are stalemated, almost 50-50 on certain abortion and same-sex marriage issues, but there is some stalemate. But I would say we're being successful because we've learned how to do politics, a methodology, tactics that work, that are seeking common ground with all those other non-Christian groups, religious and otherwise, who are saying, what do we do about these huge problems of global hunger and even climate change? We're willing to work even with environmentalists. That's the hardest one of all. We can work with Tibetan Buddhists for religious freedom. We can work with the ACLU to curb prison rape. We can collaborate with feminists like Stein on trafficking. But can we do this with tree huggers? Well, a lot of people can't abide by that. I say you're not doing tree hugging, you're doing people hugging. That's what it's really about, people.
Okay, thank you.
So there is my point in closing is there is a transition occurring here. And it's a bit of the old, they don't like to hear it, some of the leaders in their 70s. It's not bad to grow old. I prize wisdom of the elders. Bible teaches that. But there is a contest going on between, yes, the older guard and the younger guard. Let's call them older as opposed to old. There is a contest for the future of the movement. Now, will it hang together? Absolutely. But it will hang together because there's no question among the young, those under 50, that this is a broad picture agenda. And so for us, it is cooperation without compromise or capitulation. We will not capitulate to neo-fundamentalists today.
Thank you, Mr. Lugo.
Let me just pick up one of the comments you made, although I'm tempted to add to the Evangelical Bill of Indictment of the United Nations here. It is part of the hermeneutics of their understanding of the coming of the Antichrist and one world government that already induces a certain amount of skepticism. That's reinforced by the UN's attitude towards Israel, which really convinces most evangelicals this is a godless place. And it gets reinforced again by what many evangelicals believe to be the UN's pressing of progressive secular values in those areas where it is effective, in their view, which is population control and things like that. It only adds more to the deep suspicion that evangelicals have of the UN. Now, just a word, I thought you raised a very interesting point, the difference between white and black evangelicals. And I think that's a very interesting contrast because, as we know, they vote very, very differently. Yet, in terms of social values, many of these cultural or values that have defined a lot of the modern evangelical political engagement, blacks line up pretty close on a lot of these issues. In fact, on the question of gay marriage, there's even deeper passions within that we pick up in our surveys within the African American community than even within the white evangelical community. The question then is, why don't those issues then translate into a voting pattern that's similar, to white evangelicals? And I think a lot of those things have to do, history is here very important. I think socioeconomic standing is important. Although blacks take a socially, by and large, socially conservative point of view, their vote is driven by a different set of concerns, civil rights issue, social welfare issues, etc., that are important but rank lower in comparison to other issues for white evangelicals. And this is why I'm always skeptical of survey findings on any issue that's not put in the context of how people rank it with respect to other issues. I mean, there's a lot of good things that people will tell you they're for. The real rub comes, are you really for this, when you compare it to the other issues that you have to deal with? Or are you really for this if you, in the question itself, are asked, whether, that it entails certain trade-offs, such as, would you be for greater environmental protection if it entails higher taxes or the loss of jobs? If you get a very different, perspective on this, and especially, by the way, from blacks and African American and Hispanics, who tend to be the least supported. There's general support for more environmental regulation, but among those groups is where you see the biggest pushback, and it has to do, I think, with these economic issues. So now Hispanics, of course, which is the large growing segment of the population because of since post-1965 immigration, they are trending more, by and large, like African Americans in terms of their voting patterns. Again, socially conservative, but tend to vote Democratic because the vote is driven by other issues. Now, the big wild card there is Latino evangelical, whom we know voted the majority for George W. Bush. In fact, if you look at the comparison of the Latino evangelical, of the Bush Latino vote 2000 and 2004, he went up considerably. Almost all of it could be accounted for by Latino evangelicals moving more solidly to the Republican camp, which makes the whole issue of immigration debate within the Republican Party obviously have tremendous implications for the future of politics. One last thing, and I hate to complexify, as they say in the world of higher education things here, but when you step back just a little bit and look at what's going on globally, and therefore our immigration patterns and the kind of Christianity and how it's changing in this country, you're going to notice two things. One is that Protestants as a whole are decreasing as a percentage of the population. We're very close to being a minority Protestant country, which is really quite remarkable. So a lot of the evangelical gains have come at the expense of mainline churches, mainline Protestant churches. So this is very, very important to understand in terms of immigration. The other thing is that increasing immigration, which is predominantly Christian, by the way, rather than non-Christian, is remaking American Christianity in the image of how Christianity is going in the rest of the world. And that means Pentecostalism. You cannot, evangelicalism, as we know it in this country, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, is disappearing. And we know it. Now, many of the same beliefs, they're all becoming Pentecostal. Christianity is becoming highly Pentecostalized among Protestants in the two-thirds world. And Catholics and other mainstream are becoming increasingly charismatic in their approach. This is a movement that is having a profound impact, which in some ways will reinforce some of the views of American evangelicals. For instance, strongly pro-Zionist. It knocked your socks off when you read our report on global Pentecostalism, how pro-Zionist. These are people who live in countries that have no relationship whatsoever to Middle East politics. Strong pro-Zionist.
In China.
In China and other places. It's really quite in Zambia. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. But in their voting patterns, this is very interesting. In a place like Brazil, they are very much like African Americans. Here, very socially conservative. And even parties of the left have addressed their social conservatism and are winning their votes on civil rights and social welfare issues. In a place like Brazil, where the Roman Catholic Church has had power for so long, you can see the attraction of a strong civil rights emphasis for minority religious communities, although Pentecostals may soon be a majority. I mean, they're growing like crazy. So I hate to complicate your picture here, but global evangelicalism is becoming highly Pentecostalized. And I think that will introduce yet a new dimension of how we think about these issues in terms of evangelicalism and public life.
Some people say that about any.
Well, that could be.
Since Mr. Land was the only one who would adhere to the letter and the spirit of the law and spoke for 2 minutes, perhaps you would.
Well, I think complexified. That's a good
Well,
word.
that's what the academics.
Well, I like it.
I'm
I
here
like
in the
it.
academy, so I thought.
Well, I think that we're on. We're in uncharted waters here in America. I think that most people are not aware that most of the immigration in this country is Christian, and that the world is becoming more Christian. There were 29 million Christians in Africa in 1900. There are 400 million now. Soon, unless something very strange happens, in the next 20 years, if current demographic trends continue, the majority of professing Christians in the world will be non-white for the first time in the history of the Christian faith. And the trends will continue to accelerate. One of the things I didn't get to mention in my talk was that one reason that evangelicals have become increasingly interested in international affairs is that there are a lot more Christians around the world, and they have had relationships with the tens of thousands of short-term and career missionaries who are around the world. For instance, Christians in this country have been sensitized to the plight of Christians in China by the fact that there are 125 million of them now. There were 8 million Christians in China in 1949. There are 125 million now, at least, that we know of. And I think that Christianity in the second and third world tends to be traditionally, theologically, it's very traditional, very orthodox, very sort of apostolic creed kind of Christianity with a charismatic icing on it. And that's why you've got this debate going on in Anglicanism right now, because the Anglicanism in the second and third world, which is actually where it's growing rather than where it's dying, is extremely traditional. The wonderful discussion between the Anglican bishop from England with the Anglican bishop in Nigeria and the Anglican bishop from England at their last World Conference was criticizing the Nigerian bishop for his biblical literalism And the Nigerian bishop responded by saying, well, if you didn't believe the Bible, why did you bring it to us in the first place? Which, you know, that is going on. And the largest Anglican worship experience in the United Kingdom every Sunday is a church in East London where about 5,000 Nigerian immigrants meet to worship in a traditional Anglican service. And it's the largest Anglican worship service anywhere in the United Kingdom every Sunday.
All right, we are, by the way, at 5 o'clock going to, we'll probably go a little bit past that, going to have some refreshments in the Mortara Center, but now it's time for questions. Questions, not manifestos, please. We'll get as many as we can. Who would like to go? This gentleman over here, please.
My name is Don Smith. Two questions. One about the image of God. The strong image comes through of God as sort of a real estate dealer doing land deals. And about that. Is there any indication in the research about what evangelicals think about the relationship between God, the God of love, justice, mercy, vis-a-vis the Palestinians who are occupied, who lost their land, apartheid, you know, all the stuff that's going on? Is there any indication that there's any empathy there or any understanding about that situation? Second question is, do you foresee evangelicals coming to have a similar effect, or at least be as effective with regard to American foreign policy as, say, AIPAC is now?
Okay, let's take
I'll take the first one. Up until recently, a significant portion of those Palestinians were Christians. Most of them have now been forced to leave by the Palestinian Authority, and having forced them to pay an intifada tax, etc. And they're very concerned about the persecution of Christian Palestinians by Hamas, which is much worse than the persecution or any discrimination they faced from the State of Israel and from the Jewish authorities. But I would point out to you that in 2004, approximately 40% of George W. Bush's raw vote came from self-professed evangelicals. And this was after George W. Bush became the first American president in history to go on record as putting the United States in support of an independent Palestinian self-governing state on the West Bank and Gaza. So yes, there's concern for the plight of all people, including Palestinians. But I would go back, I think most evangelicals agree with Abba Eban, the wonderfully eloquent foreign minister in the past, who said the plight of Arab refugees is a real one and it needs to be dealt with. But if the other side had won, there would be no Jewish refugees. They'd all be dead.
Mr. Cizik, and we'll take another question. Mr. Lugo.
Well, one's understanding of God is in part one's cultural, historical place in history. It's very interesting. Evangelical Christians in Africa, their understanding of God is rooted in their liberation. And this doesn't make them liberation theologically in the sense that there are leftists who are liberation theologians. No, their sense of God as Redeemer and Savior is rooted in their local context at times. Our best historian on the Global South at Penn State is, remind me, Phil Jenkins. Phil writes about this in his book. In fact, in the New Christendom, he talks, in fact, in whole places throughout Africa, the Holy Spirit in these evangelicals is referred to, understood as the keeper of the land. Isn't that interesting? And so how this movement in Africa, which Richard's right, is growing rapidly, now 400 plus million, by mid-century, 21st century, will be 1.2 billion Pentecostals in Africa. How they translate their faith will impact enormously the governments they live in and under. And you can imagine that we've got people today like Mugabe in Zimbabwe who came to power willing to kill tens of thousands. And I'm wondering how rulers like that are going to live in the how they're going to survive. He's being told it's time to leave. The stage, exit right. is now. But leaders that practice those kinds of policies, I don't think have much of a future if Africa becomes evangelical Christian.
I'll just make one quick statement since somebody mentioned liberation theology, which popularized this phrase of having a preferential option for the poor. And what I will tell you is that sociologically what has happened is that liberation theology opted for the poor, and the poor opted for Pentecostalism.
Okay, let's take some quick questions. Sir, please.
Richard Weiss with USAID. It seems, in looking at the ranking of issues of importance to evangelicals, it has always struck me the absence of concern about the poor, concern about world hunger. When the Bible, this is a biblically based movement, the Bible is so full of talk about poverty. Why, or perhaps historically this is something that comes in waves, why isn't it among the most pressing social concerns of the evangelical movement?
A point that Jim Wallace has made. Who would like to take the question? Repeat of it. There are 3,000 verses in the Bible, according to Reverend Wallace, that pertain to poverty.
Well, first of all, I would dispute the fact that evangelicals aren't concerned about the poor. They are. I mean, if you look at giving patterns, if you look at the work that's been done by Brooks at Syracuse, it is conservatives, and particularly religious conservatives, that give much larger portions of their income personally and through their churches to the relief of people who are suffering in poverty and suffering in other ways. The one thing that's good that Mississippi actually is first in is per capita charitable giving.
Yes.
I mean, if you're, Mississippians tell me this because they're grasping for anything. They're usually last, and they're competing with Arkansas for being last and everything that's good, and competing with Arkansas for being first and everything that's bad. And so they're first actually in per capita charitable giving, and Mississippi also happens to be one of the most religious states, both black and white. And by the way, Mississippi is the largest percentage African-American state in the United States. About 47% of Mississippians are African-Americans. I think that there does get to be a question of prudentiality. Jim Wallace was mentioned, so I'll pick on him. Jim Wallace did everything but run through the halls of Congress with his hair on fire, saying that the welfare reform was going to be a catastrophe for America's poor, and that hundreds of thousands of Americans would be dropping dead from starvation in the streets of the American cities. Well, that's not what happened. In fact, I think we would have to say that the welfare reform has been a qualified success, that it has been more of a success than a failure.
But this is a discussion about American foreign policy, not domestic policy.
Well, you look at the work that they do. When you talk about, we tend as Americans to sort of assume this because it's part of the furniture in the room. But no other country has the kind of private charitable enterprises that we have, particularly religious affiliated ones. Southern Baptists, for instance, give tens of millions of dollars every year in hunger relief through their mission agencies around the world, and every other denomination I know does the same thing. What I was trying to get at is there may be a real distinction that's lost in some of the polling between government relief for the poor and person-to-person relief for the poor. You look at what Rick Warren, who's a Southern Baptist minister in Southern California, is doing in terms of not only AIDS relief, but poverty relief in sub-Saharan Africa, and you get the picture of a sort of a direct kind of thing as opposed to government aid.
The other change is reflected in a poll done by the 475 leaders of the NAE in 1990 that we commissioned John Green to do and did again in the year 2000. I asked him 1990 and then 2000 to ask the question, how do you change the world most? And the switch was literally a flip. In 1990, they overwhelmingly, 75% said you change the world one person at a time by changing their hearts. In the year 2000, 75% said, you change it by changing one person's heart at a time, and you address the structural evils that exist. And so, while I would agree that we are organizationally pretty adept, I'm not sure we're institutionally geniuses. Historically, evangelicals have been anti-institutional. This was Chris Smith out of UNC. So, what is occurring, though, among the younger generation is that they don't grow up with the social concern idea as a liberal mainline idea. The split, they don't have in their heads. It never existed. And so their mentality is, if you go anywhere, I've been across the spectrum from the most liberal, according to Princeton Review, this is in New York City, the University City, CUNY, but anyway, all the way from New York City to Multnomah Bible College. And what did I discover? The Multnomah Bible Colleges, frankly, have a more internationalist agenda than some of the liberals who are going, you know, to secular universities. This is amazing. It's what Mead picked up too. And it's this engagement with people on the ground in the global South. That is what's changing. And so the past is at times prologue, but not always. In this case, the disconnect from our old bifurcated, balkanized view is gone.
Mr. Knight has to go, so get him while he's up. We'll get this person.
I'll speak loudly from here, I hope. My name is Michelle Clark. I'm the head of the anti-trafficking effort at the OSCE in Vienna. And my question is about human trafficking. The evangelical community, certainly along with other notable pieces of legislation, has done a lot on this. But in my 10 years as an activist at the political level and at the grassroots in this field, I'm beginning to worry considerably because I feel that there's a resting upon the laurels of rhetoric and politics, and that there's not the kind of grassroots sustaining push that is going to keep the politicians and the funders honest in order to continue to change the behaviors that will need to happen to end this human rights violation. The rhetoric is the same as it was 10 years ago. The examples that are given in testimonies are the same that they were. The behaviors have not changed, although the policy and the legislation has. And I would be interested in hearing what you gentlemen would have to say.
Well, Condoleezza Rice spoke at the Southern Baptist Convention's annual session last summer. And I would encourage all of you to go and look at it on the website. It was a truly extraordinary performance on her part. And it was in Greensboro, North Carolina. And she gives a speech to the Southern Baptist Convention. She gets 14 standing ovations from about 20,000 elected messengers to the Southern Baptist Convention. One of which she got when she said, "Do you realize that if I fill out my full term as Secretary of State, it will have been 12 years since a white male was Secretary of State." She got a standing ovation from a lot of white males and a lot of white females and some African Americans and some Hispanics. And but she said slavery, she got another standing ovation. It was perhaps the most sustained one she got when she said slavery didn't end in the 19th century. It is alive and well in the 21st century, and this administration will not rest until it is eliminated. And that was the longest and most sustained applause, standing ovation that she got during 14 standing ovations during about a 37-minute speech. So I think that grassroots action needs to continue in terms of encouraging officials to do what they should do, and it needs to be revisited from time to time. And it's up to us to do it, and it's up to us to hold the politicians accountable for what they do and what they don't do. We have run into, I must confess to you that on this issue, we've run into more resistance on this issue from officials, both our officials and European officials, than I would have expected. And I'm not sure quite how to account for that other than the depravity of man.
Well, there's one other factor, Richard. It is this, other than the depravity of man, it is that religion, to quote Doug Johnston, is still the missing dimension in American foreign policy. The number of people who understand, as reflected even in the Iraq war, is pretty obvious. I mean, not very many have truly understood the religious dynamics in Iraq. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in.
Okay, one more question, and maybe we can draw upon the considerable abilities of the estimable Mr. Lugo. Yes, sir?
Well, actually, this is addressed to Mr. Lugo. When I was going, many years ago, when I was going to college, I read these books by Hans Morgenthau and by George Kennan and Walter Lippmann, and they all made this, they said the basic distinction in US foreign policy was between the so-called idealists on the one hand and the realists on the other. But looking at your chart and listening to what you were all saying, it occurred to me for the first time that really there's a tripartite distinction in US foreign policy attitudes. There are biblical idealists, such as the Evangelicals. There are secular idealists, like the editors of the New York Times. And then there are realists, conservatives like Jim Baker, let's say. And do you think that that's accurate?
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation, yeah. Certainly in terms of popular opinion, I think it's no contest between idealism and realism. Most Americans, whether religiously inspired or others, fall on the idealist side. Intellectuals who come from Europe and understand that diplomatic tradition, or Henry Kissinger and others, Hans Morgenthau, they take a different line. But I think in terms of public opinion, that's very much a minority position. I mean, realpolitik is not rolling out of the tongues of most Americans, including evangelicals. I didn't want this to go unnoticed, and maybe it was said so quickly that you folks didn't fully realize it. I think the point both Richards made with respect to evangelicals and their view of government, and what's possible through government and what's not possible, I think that's a very critical role, and a very critical issue. And I think partly accounts for why Black and Latino evangelicals are different than white evangelicals. If you look at our survey results on general attitudes towards government, you get much more positive responses from Black and Latino evangelicals than you do from white evangelicals. So for many white evangelicals is what that Richard said, which is, they see that mission is being carried through the church and at the sub-governmental level. They just don't trust government to do it. Whereas in the African American community, the Latino community, much more open to combining the two. And I do think it's also generational. I think this Richard is right in that younger white evangelicals are much more open to wedding the two. Personal transformation through the church, but also government programs. I think that's a very important dimension here that I don't think ought to be lost. If you look at our survey, white evangelicals weren't too hot on George Bush's faith-based initiative, truth be told. They loved him, they trusted him, but not very hot on it. They were deeply concerned about this compassionate conservatism stuff. In fact, it was John DiIulio, the first director of the faith-based initiative, who wrote that piece, and he's a Democrat, a faithful Catholic Democrat. The second director, was also a Roman Catholic of that faith-based office, Jim Tuitt, which I thought was interesting. They finally found an evangelical in Jay Hine. But it took them 3 tries to get somebody who was not a Roman Catholic. I think that's very, very interesting. It wasn't until groups attacked the faith-based initiative because it brought religion too much into public life that white evangelicals then responded and said, well, if you want a culture war over this issue, we'll challenge you there too. But truth be told, I don't think they're all that hot, judging from our surveys, concerning the original proposition. So I do think this question about the role of government and trust in government just generally to tackle problems is one that's undergoing some evolution in the evangelical community, but still significant distrust whether to solve issues here or abroad.
Yeah, I'll close my comments by saying the politician that will succeed in the 21st century evangelicalism is the politician that will understand the initiative that is responsible for ultimately changing life. The individual initiative that comes in the personal conversion of individuals, but also the individual initiative that comes through social entrepreneurialism and the like. The politician will be successful when he's able to understand that dynamic in our movement and be able to properly wed it to what can be accomplished through government, because we do have that kind of skepticism, both here and abroad. It's why we've been somewhat critical of the UN over the years, rightly so. And so merging those two and balancing it out is, I think, what will ultimately win out, because, leave you with this thought, as evangelicalism goes, so goes the West.
Okay, thank you. We're going to invite you all to the Mortara Center for International Affairs. I'm a New Yorker, so somebody help me with the directions. We go down in front of the gate, and it's located on 36th 36th and N, you're all welcome to be our guests. I'd like to thank Mr. Land, Mr. Cizik, and Mr. Lugo for a very interesting panel.